What about the media? There are some very fine Supreme Court reporters, and Linda Greenhouse, who just left the New York Times as their Supreme Court reporter, immediately comes to mind. But what about the reporters who switch beats and who cover the courts for some short period of time and then move on to other beats? Are the courts being covered in the same way that, say, the presidency or at the state level, state government is covered?
Clearly not. And I was going to say, in some way, it's a little bit our responsibility to the judiciary, in the sense that we stay somewhat, we're neutral and apart and separate and maybe a little bit aloof sometimes. And I think more efforts are being made to reach out to the public, to inform, for judges to try to, in an impartial, neutral way, to try to educate the public a bit, and I might say to educate the media as well, because we do find exactly what you have said, Meryl, that a cub reporter will start, and as soon as the probationary period is over, that person just moves on from the courts to something else.
And 30 years ago, roughly, at Yale Law School, where I teach, we started a program, and a number of law schools have programs like this now, where journalists can come to law school for a year. Yes. Take journalists who cover the law, especially who cover courts. They come to law school for a year, and they take courses a law student would take, because it's not just courts they don't understand, it's the entire legal process is kind of a black box. Sometimes even the journalists spend a lot of time with it. Linda Greenhouse went through that program. She was one of the very first people to...
and we have one at Georgetown now as well.
And there are more, but it turns out, interestingly, it's a little hard to fund these programs. That foundations somehow don't find this quite as exciting as some of the other things programs that schools might adapt. And so every couple of years, it's a big effort to go out and get the money, in a sense, to keep a program like this going. I think these things are vitally important if we're going to rely on the media, as we must, as the gatekeeper of information, even in an era of exploding sources of information. It's good that reporters know what they're talking about.
Well, what about cameras in the courtroom? I know one of your former colleagues said that they would come into the Supreme Court over his dead body, but good idea, bad idea?
Well, I was going to say a couple of things. One, there used to be, all the networks had a reporter that would cover the Supreme Court. There was Tim O'Brien, and then it was someone else from CBS, and it was now Pete Williams is the only one on the network that does, and he's got all these other beats. I had friends who did that. Tim O'Brien was one of them for ABC, and he would be so frustrated because if it was a very important Supreme Court decision, he'd maybe get 42 seconds on the evening news to explain a complicated Supreme Court decision. So that some of the journalists are very good. Linda Greenhouse is outstanding. Nina Totenberg is outstanding. And Nina at least has more time on National Public Radio. I learned something from the case that I handled in the Supreme Court and after the election. I'm not going to mention the name of that case in this audience. But what the Supreme Court did for the first time in that case was to release an audio of the transcript, audio of the argument in the Supreme Court to the public the instant the argument was over. And that was broadcast on C-SPAN and on NPR, and people all over the world listened to the arguments by the lawyers and the questions by the justices. And I can't tell you how many people came up to me and said, I had no idea it was like that. They thought that lawyers would give a speech to the Supreme Court and that was it. They were fascinated by the fact that the justices were engaged on these issues, were asking questions. It was a dialogue back and forth. They were fascinated with the process, as a result of which their respect for the process, including the decision, grew. I don't know that the court can do that very much, but
they've been doing it a lot lately, and I think it's helpful. In fact, some of the television stations have been playing it, and they show faces of the
drawings
speakers as it goes, and you feel like you're there.
But I think your court does.
Yes, I was going to say in the state of New York, all of our arguments are videotaped. You can get a really good night's sleep in the city of Albany.
watching those arguments.
Yes, watching those arguments. But I think what's really interesting is that they don't generate much press coverage. And I have threatened from time to time to hang a sign on the door of the court, of my court, saying, "Press not allowed." And then we would have a case, and then we would have people storming the barricades.
I know the justices don't, the justices on your court, Justice O'Connor, don't want those televisions in the courtroom, but I think they're worried that people will be grandstanding. I think they're worried that they will lose their anonymity a little bit, and that they will be people that are unhappy with decisions will notice them on the street corner and things like that. There's probably better reasons, but every person that I've experienced who has come to the Supreme Court of the United States, who has watched an argument, walks out of that building in awe of the institution, the fact that it faces the various positions face to face, it listens to the arguments, it's read the briefs, the justices have read the briefs, they ask really penetrating questions, and then they decide the case, and then they explain why they decided. None of the other two branches of our government do things that way, so people have huge respect for the court and the justices, and it is true that the judiciary has higher status in the American public than the other two branches of government. I think that the time may come where the court will decide that from an education, students in high school watching a video of a Supreme Court argument on an important case like a death penalty case would come away with it in awe and with greater respect for the institution.
Well, I think I have to, I hate to disagree with Ted Olson and with Judge Kaye, but I actually think it's a bad idea. I'm not an enthusiast. I like to think that I think we have to judge our courts by their output, not the input. Right. And already we spend so much time paying attention to oral arguments and trying to guess what this person is going to do based on some question. And I can imagine playing the clip over and over again on the evening news of Justice so-and-so leaning this way rather than that way, and the various talking heads interpreting the scratch of the head or the tone of voice. I think it's a terrible thing, but it may be inevitable, though you may be right. Along this line, I do think, though, I mentioned the information age and the internet a moment ago. I think the internet is a wonderful resource for bringing a lot of law home to people. You can get court decisions on the internet. You can get federal statutes on the internet. You can get most state statutes on the internet. And I want to mention this. There are states in the United States, and some of you probably live in some of them, that will not allow a copy of their state code, the law that binds everyone, to be available for free online. There are about 4 or 5 states, and it seems to be...
Well, that can't be copyrighted.
Well, but here's the problem. They claim they have these exclusive contracts with people to post them online that they get paid for. There's current litigation. I think, is it Oregon? I think is involved in litigation over this right now. They have a variety of theories. None of the theories are copyright, but they have a variety of theories about why they should have exclusivity. The state, as an entity, should have exclusivity over who gets to publish its statutes, which is, to me, an absurdity. And if any of you live in these states and they have these practices, you must fight against them. This would be
I want
wrong.
to take that case. That's a First Amendment.
Pro bono.
Yeah.
Oh, of course, pro bono. Just like the New York case.